So about a year ago, my mother had to give up her car. And there was good reasons. She literally bumped into something with her car every single day. And she'd bump into a pole, another car, a pedestrian, small children. She was bumping into stuff. She'd get me really mad at me for telling you this story.
Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
Well, today my message is entitled Grapes of Wrath, not to be confused with the Don Cherry story, The Wrath of Grapes. And that's actually true. There is a story called The Wrath of Grapes about Don Cherry. And I don't know if you know how he got that nickname. His name is Don Cherry, and they call him Grapes. And that's because his rants on CBC Hockey Night in Canada sound more like sour grapes than cherries. And so he got that nickname. But no, I'm going to be talking about the book, The Grapes of Wrath, written by John Steinbeck, not to be confused with Henry Winkler. A little Southern Manitoba humor for you there. And of course, he wasn't a Southern Manitoban at all. John Steinbeck was, of course, an American writer. He wrote The Grapes of Wrath, which was a Nobel Prize-winning piece of literature. And it's the story of the Jodes back in the 30s. They're living in this Oklahoma, and it's the dirty 30s, it's the Depression, it's the Dust Bowl. The economy has just gone kaput in Oklahoma. And they decide as a family they're going to pack up their worldly belongings, everything they have, and as a family they're going to travel to California. Because California is the land of promise, it's the land of milk and honey, it's the land of grape orchards, in fact. And they're going to go work in the orchards, and they'd heard all about it and how everybody was prospering in the abundance. So they pack up and they get on the road, and their adventure turns into more of a misadventure. And of course, they're struggling all the way along as they're traveling, and many other, as they call them, Okies on the turn and on the journey. And of course, then returning, going the other way, they meet up with people who are coming back from California and saying it's not everything that you think it's going to be. And the whole point of this book is this, and John Steinbeck said this himself, that it was about the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. And we need to persist, and we just need to keep on keeping on. So there's this story about this duck. And so this duck walks into a 7-Eleven and says to the clerk, "Do you have any grapes?" The clerk says, "We're a convenience store. We don't sell grapes." The next day, the duck's back in the 7-Eleven, says, "Do you sell any grapes?" The clerk says, "I told you yesterday we don't sell grapes. We're a convenience store." So the third day, the duck shows up one more time and says to the clerk, "Do you have any grapes?" The clerk gets mad and says, "I told you 3 times now, we don't sell grapes. If you come back in here and ask for grapes one more time, I'm going to nail your web feet to the floor." The next day, the duck comes in and says, "Do you have any nails?" And the clerk says, "No, we're a convenience store. We don't sell nails." He said, "I thought so. Do you have any grapes?" That story makes almost no sense. But it's all about perseverance, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to pick up the story, and the story we're going to look at today is a grape story. And it's a story about the children of Israel going into the promised land, a land that is flowing with milk and honey, and one that is punctuated by the abundance of grapes. And so we're going to read the story first, and then I'll give you some insight into it. And so we're in Numbers chapter 13, verse 17. And then it says this, "Then Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan and said to them, 'Go up this way into the south and go up into the mountains and see what the land is like, whether the people who dwell in it are strong or weak, few or many, whether the land they dwell in is good or bad, whether the cities they inhabit are like camps or strongholds, whether the land is rich or poor, whether there are forests there or not, be of good courage, and bring back some of the fruit of the land.' Now the time was the season of the first ripe grapes." So there's our grapes connection there. Now, of course, you remember the story that they had never been to the promised land. Nobody had ever been there. They didn't know what was going on in there. They got to the edge of it, And so he decides the best thing to do is send some spies in. So he sends 12 spies in. We know 2 of them were Joshua and Caleb. We don't know who the other 10 were. But anyway, they get sent in. And he gives them a bunch of questions. He says, this is what we need to know. Is the land good or bad? Which one was it, good or bad? That was good. Was it rich or poor? It was rich. But then he has some other questions. He said, are the people there few or many? Which one were they? They were many. And he says, did they live in camps or strongholds? They lived in strongholds. And so there was a lot of, here's what we find out about this. The message they brought back was that there's the good with the bad. And that's a bit of a metaphor for life, because whether you like this or not, you're going to have to take the good with the bad. That's what they had. It was the promised land. The land that God had given them or was giving them, and they had to be prepared to take the good with the bad. They had to be prepared to take the grapes and the sour grapes, or the grapes of wrath. And they were going to have both there. And I'm going to give you the bad news right up front. I might as well do that, right? Get it out of the way. Here's the bad news. You will have adversity in life. That's a promise. Jesus said, you will have tribulation in this world, but be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world. He has promised this adversity. And here's where I'm going with this. Almost all the good that you will have in your life will come to you first through adversity. You know that when God gives us promises, almost every one of those promises comes to us through some sort of pain. The threshold that we cross is pain. When you look at life, all of life's like that. Let me give you a few examples. Birth, for example. You came into this world through birth. Pain or pleasure? Well, maybe not for you, but it was pain for your parents. Pain for your mother for sure. Blood, sweat, tears, wailing and gnashing of teeth. That is a painful experience, and it was part of the curse, right? God said, in pain and sorrow you will bring forth children into this world. It's just the reality of it. So we came into the world. The first threshold we passed was a threshold of pain of our mother. I don't know if you know this, but now they're trying to reduce pain. They've got lots of things. And one of the things is underwater births. Have you heard about this? And apparently it's less stressful for the mother and for the baby. Terrifying for the rest of the swimmers in the pool. But, And every transition we have in life, I want you to think about this. Pretty much every transition we ever have in life will go through pain. I mean, for example, the transition from childhood to adulthood goes through that thing. What's it called? Puberty! That's what it's called. The most painful experience for any human being is going through puberty. Your face breaks out in pimples. You've got this massive sense of insecurity. You're humiliated by your teachers and your parents and pretty much every single thing you try to do. I call puberty or adolescence the awkward years from 12 to 29. And so somewhere in that range. And then, of course, if you're going to have any kind of prosperity in this world, we also know that prosperity will come through the pain of work. And that's part of the curse. Through toil and the sweat of your brow, through thorns and thistles, you will bring forth produce in the world. That is part of the journey. Unless you were born royalty or into a wealthy family, guess what? You're going to end up with prosperity if you work hard, but you will go through some level of pain to get there. And then when the whole thing is said and done, and we go on to our reward in heaven, what is the one thing you have to do to get to heaven? Die! You have to die. And you know what? Most of us aren't afraid of death. I'm not afraid of death. It's dying I'm afraid of, right? I mean, death, once you're across there, big deal. It's the pain of dying and sickness and old age. People don't like the dying part. But that's just sort of the way it is. If you're going to go to heaven, you've got to die. So I think you get the point here that our journey in life is always going to be one where we have to transition through pain or transition through adversity. And so I'm calling that the grapes of wrath, the challenging part. The blessings in life are the grapes, and the adversities in life are the grapes of wrath. And I'm going to give you 3 things today that are going to help you make that transition. Here they are, throwing them up on the screen. And they're perspective, persistence, and patience. And the first one, and it's really important, is our perspective on these things. So I told you that they sent 12 spies in, and 2 of them were named Joshua and Caleb. And they came back, and they brought their report. And they said, let us go up at once, for we are well able to overcome it. That's what they said about the promised land. And then the other 10 came back, and they said this. They said, we are not able to take the land, for the people who dwell there are stronger than us, and we are as grasshoppers in our own sight, and also theirs. My question for you is, did those two groups of people see the same thing? Were they on a different trip? They were on exactly the same trip. They were on exactly the same journey. They were together. The only difference between those two groups is what? Their perspective. One saw the grapes, the other one saw the grapes of wrath. And did they have grapes? How many remember what they brought back? Grapes. How big were the grapes? Big. It said that the bunch of grapes that they brought back to show the children of Israel was so big, they had to carry one bunch of grapes on a pole on the shoulders of two men. Those are some big grapes. You do not get grapes like that at Superstore. I'll tell you not. But this is the kind of grapes they brought up. So we have these two. We have Joshua and Caleb, and they're seeing the grapes, and the other two are seeing the grapes of wrath. And see, here's the key, people, and I don't want you to miss this. A lot of times we see the same thing, but it's all about perspective. How do you see it? 100 years ago, there was these two shoe salesmen, and they went to Africa 100 years ago, so put it in context. And they get there, and the first one is dismayed, and he says, "We're going to be broke. No one here wears shoes." The second one says, "We're going to be rich. Everybody needs shoes here." It's all a matter of perspective. What are we going to see? And so that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about fine-tuning your perspective here so we can understand when we look at life, what are we going to see? Are we going to see the grapes, or are we going to see the grapes of wrath? And so when we look at this scripture, there's one story that I particularly like. And I've told it many times, but it's worth repeating. And it's the story of Peter when he walks on water. Now, you remember the context of this. The disciples were out in the Sea of Galilee. They were in a big storm. The water was coming into the boat. Jesus was not with them. And then he comes to them in the dead of night walking on the water. And, of course, the other bunch in the boat, they see what? They see a ghost. They think it's Jesus the ghost. Peter's looking out. He thinks it's Jesus. And he does something I think is a little bizarre. He wants to get out of the boat and walk on water. That's not what I would have been thinking about. I don't know about you. I mean, I'm thinking, save us, get the water out of the boat, still the storm, do one of those things. He looks at Jesus and said, "If it's you, Lord, bid me to come." He said, "It's me, come on down," like Bob Barker. And so he steps out of the boat and he starts walking on the water. Remember this? And he's walking on the water. How many of you have ever done this? A couple of you have done it? Okay. I've done it too, but I can barefoot water ski. I can walk on water as long as the boat goes 60 miles an hour. Anyway, he's walking on water, he's doing it. And then the next line is so incredible. I mean, as far as we know, Peter's the only one in history that we know of that ever walked on water. And then as he's walking on the water and as he's halfway to Jesus, the scripture says this, then he saw that the winds and the waves were boisterous and he began to sink. What did he do? He got his eyes off of the promise and onto the problem. And in his mind, the problem was that the winds were boisterous. I don't know what difference does that make. Well, sure you do. I mean, it's way easier to walk on calm water, right? I mean, when you've all seen those mornings where it's still and there's no wind and the water's like glass. Anybody can walk on that, right? It's when it gets rough, it's hard to walk on. And so, the winds were boisterous and he began to sink. Why? Because he got his eyes off of the promise and onto the problem. And I'll tell you something, folks, that is a metaphor for human nature. And what happens when we are when we are in trouble, what we do is we typically focus on the problem. See, when you're broke, all you can think about is the fact that you're broke. All you can think about is the fact that your bank account's empty, your wallet is empty. That's all you can think about. When you are depressed, all you can think about is how miserable you feel inside. When you are sick, all you can think about is the fact that you are unwell and that you're in pain or any of these things. And I'm not judging you for that. That's human nature. But I'm telling you, it's self-defeating. Because what we are doing is we are looking at the problem. We are not looking at the promise. And I'll tell you, I'm not saying it's easy, but it's the most important thing you can do. So let me tell you a story about this from my own life. It has to do with my brother. If you've read my book, A Greater Purpose, it's in that book. Or if you've been around here long enough, you'll know this story. And about a dozen years ago, my brother was in a ski accident and broke his neck. And he ended up in the hospital. He was paralyzed initially. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He could only move his neck. He could move his fingers just a tiny little bit, but he was mostly paralyzed. He's what they call a C3-4 incomplete. So he was quadriplegic. And I'm telling you, there is really very few things worse than a spinal cord injury. I mean, it's just a horrific injury that affects every part of your body. And there he was in the hospital. They told him he'd never walk again. They told him, you'll be in the hospital for a year, and just to get used to that. And my brother was just one of these incredibly stubborn people. And I just want you, if you imagine this picture, he hasn't been there very long. He's in the hospital. He can't move anything from the neck down. And he's lying on the bed looking at the ceiling. We often ask the most inappropriate questions. So there he is, lying there, can only stare at the ceiling. I walked in, I said, so Brad, what are you up to today? What a stupid question, right? I mean, what do I think he's up to? But that's what came out of my mouth. To which he said, when I said, what are you up to today? He said, I'm playing tennis. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, every day I play tennis. He says, I'm lying here, I got lots of time on my hands, I don't have to go to work, so I play tennis. He said, I imagine every serve and every volley and every play, I imagine that. I go through the whole set, the whole match in my mind. He says, this afternoon I'm going kayaking. And what my brother did was he had to retreat to that place because he couldn't do anything physically. He had to retreat to everything mentally to deal with this. And so he began to deal with this. And then it turned out that my brother was possibly one of the worst patients that hospital had ever had. And whenever they asked him about something, they say, in 3 months we're going to do such and such. He says, well, that's fine because I won't be here in 3 months. He said, every week he said, I'm getting out next week. And he told everybody that came to visit him, well, I'm getting out next week. And they're looking at him going, really? And he just told everybody. And then after about two months' time, they said he was going to rehab and he was getting a little feeling back and things were going a little better. And they said, we need to fit you for a wheelchair. He said, I'm not getting fitted for a wheelchair because I'm walking out of here. And they went, no, you really have to get fitted for a wheelchair because you're rolling out of here. He says, I am walking out of this place and you're not fitting me for a wheelchair. He's one seriously bad patient. And so he just drove everybody, the doctors, the nurses, drove everybody crazy. Anyway, at 2.5 months after his injury, he had these muscle spasms that would cause his whole body to go stiff, and he could actually stand up when he spasmed. And at 2.5 months, with the help of his wife, he walked out of that hospital. No, didn't walk like you or me. He walked like Frankenstein. His muscles had spasmed up, and he walked out like this, and he turned around in the hospital and in the elevator, and the nurses and doctors were all there, and he went, so long, suckers. The worst patient ever. And he went down the elevator, and we took him home. And anyway, he had some level of improvement and was able to, a bunch of good things happen. And he was just determined that he was going to get better, and he was always looking forward. And then 5 months after his injury, we took him down to the lake for the first time after 5 months, a place he loved. And he tells us he wants to go kayaking. And we went, okay. So me and my other brother, we loaded him into the kayak, and we gave him the paddle. Well, he didn't have any hand strength. He couldn't grip a paddle. And so we pulled a red green, and we duct taped his hands to the paddle. And we put a life jacket on him as well, by the way. And so we got him into the kayak, got the paddle duct taped onto his hands, and then we pushed him out into the water like this, and he kind of floated along, and he wasn't paddling. He was just sort of floating. It was a real calm day. My other brother turns to me and said, wouldn't that be a kick in the head if he rolled over and drowned? Let me tell you something about adversity. If you don't keep a sense of humor about it, you're finished. And you can't just go through life taking everything seriously and feeling sorry for yourself all the time. You've got to be willing to deal with your perspective. See, let me let you on a little clue here. That God will not always change your situation, but He can always change your perspective. And if you can change your perspective, you can change everything. So the first thing is perspective. The second thing is persistence. So I want to tell you a little story that I think will really help you on persistence, because persistence is one of the most powerful forces in the universe. So about a year ago, my mother had to give up her car. And there was good reasons. She literally bumped into something with her car every single day. And she'd bump into a pole, another car, a pedestrian, small children. She was bumping into stuff. She'd get me really mad at me for telling you this story. And I said, Mom, you got to give up the car. And finally she agreed that she would give up the car. And so I said, I'll sell the car for you. Me and my other brothers, we said, we'll sell the car for you. So I brought it over to my house. It was literally banged up on all four sides, all four corners. And so, I bolted the bumper back on, put the wheel wells back on. I changed the headlights and the taillights, which were all broken. And, did the touch-up paint, buffed the thing all up. You think I'm joking. I'm not joking. And I looked at it, I thought, it doesn't look too bad. And so my other brother put it on Kijiji for $7,000. And these two guys show up at my house. My brother comes over too. And these two guys show up at my house. And they're new Canadians. I think they seem like they're Middle Eastern of some sort. Anyway, so they come and they want the car. And so we start negotiating like you do. And so, they offered 6. We were asking 7. And so finally we said, we got down to 65. They were still at 6. And I said, it's $6,500, take it or leave it. The whole time he had $1,000 in his hand. And he was waving the $1,000. And he said, I'm prepared, like I'm motivated by that, like really. And he's waving $1,000 at us and saying, I got $1,000, I'll put $1,000 cash down right now, we'll give you $6,000. I said, it's $6,500, you can take it or leave it. So I turned and went into the house. 20 minutes later, I look out the window, they're still there. And so I go out and I said, why are you still there? They said, we want to buy the car. I said, then buy it. It's $6,500. They said, we want to buy it for $6,000. And they would, honest to goodness, they would not leave. They would not leave. They stood in my driveway, honest to God truth, for 2 hours. They stood there for 2 hours. They kept knocking on the door. They kept on asking, saying, they've got $1,000, got $1,000. I said, it's 65, it's not 1,000. And I knew the car was going to sell. And so anyway, after 2 hours, my brother was so sick of this. And I turned to him, I said, let's just give him the stupid car. I don't care. He said, I don't care either. I said, what's your time worth? He said, well, my time's not worth anything. I said, well, mine's valuable. Let's get them out of here. And so we told them we'd take $6,000. They were so happy. They gave us $1,000 cash, and we wrote the deal up. I was lying in bed that night thinking to myself, I can't believe that guy wore me down. I mean, I'm a pretty good negotiator. But I got so sick of him that I wanted them to leave. And I thought it was worth $500 to get them off of my property. This was the way I was thinking about it. And I thought to myself, you know what? This will make a great sermon illustration someday. Everything's a sermon illustration for me. I think it'll be a great sermon illustration where Jesus tells people to continue praying and do not get weary in praying and faint not. And I thought this will make a good illustration for that point. So the story's not over. The next day, they phone my brother and say, we need out of the deal. We bought another car. I'm not joking. And then my brother said, tough, you're buying this one. And then he played hardball with them. And so anyway, he says, you can either walk away from it. You're walking away from the $1,000. The guy started to cry on the phone. And he said, I've got a family. I can't afford to buy 2 cars. My brother said, you should have thought of that yesterday when you're waving $1,000 in my face. And so then my brother comes over, and we're dealing with this thing. I thought, I can't believe we're dealing with this thing. Now, I'm the nicest guy you'll ever meet. You probably all know that, right? And I said, I don't care. Give him his $1,000 back. I don't care. We'll get $6,500. My brother says, I'm not giving it back. I'm not giving him $1,000. They can either walk or buy the car. And I thought, man, this is a real lesson on persistence. I saw theirs yesterday and my brother's today. And my brother dug in his heels and made that guy borrow enough money to buy 2 cars. I'm not joking. I would have let him off the hook, because did I mention how nice I was? And I thought, well, what a picture of persistence. The picture I'm trying to paint for you is not to go out and negotiate. Don't be that jerk. But what I'm trying to point out to you is that's how you deal with the adversities of life. So when you're facing the grapes of wrath, which you will, which I've already determined today, you're going to need persistence. Let me show you something. It's in James chapter 1. You all know James chapter 1. I preach on it all the time. Count it all joy, brethren, when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience, and when patience has its perfect work, you will be complete, lacking nothing. So you've all heard me preach on that, to count it all joy. I want to give you the J.B. Phillips translation of that verse. I think you're going to like it. Here's what he says. He says, when all kinds of trials and tribulations crowd into your lives, my brothers, don't resent them as intruders, but welcome them as friends. Realize that they come to test your faith and to produce in you the quality of endurance. Is he for real? You know what? I think that's actually a proper interpretation of this passage. You see, adversity is not a thief to come and steal your happiness. Adversity is a friend to bring you the gift of perseverance. You say, it's a gift I don't want. Of course you don't want it. But there's something about this passage that will actually lead you into success in life. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Dr. Paul Brand. I'm not talking about the country western guy, Paul Brand. I'm talking about the doctor. He was a missionary in India years ago, and his specialty was leprosy. And here's his book. His book is called, catch the title, Pain, the Gift Nobody Wants. And what he talks about, why he talks about pain as a gift, I'll tell you why, is and I've been to leper colonies, I've seen this, and leprosy is a terrible disease, and what happens primarily, amongst other things, but primarily they lose all the feeling in their extremities. And so they lose their sense of touch in their face and in their hands and in their feet, and they lose their sense of pain. And most of the limbs that they lose don't just actually fall off. You see, when people say their toes and fingers fall off, that's actually not true. What ends up happening is they end up cutting their fingers off, or burning their fingers, or burning their hands, or burning their feet, because they have no pain. And they're stubbing their toes, and they're breaking and injuring parts of their body, and that's why and so Paul Brand writes this book and says people don't realize that pain is a gift that God has given you. And pain is one of the things that helps us navigate life, and it knows when to pull back and when to go forward. And if you didn't have, just think about this for a moment. What would you do without the gift of pain? Pain is one of these things that helps you get through life. And we never think of it in those terms. But that's why when we look at how life works, in order to get to the promise, you have to transition through pain. How you deal with pain is going to be a very important thing. So the first thing, if you're going to deal with the grapes of wrath, what do you need? The first thing is you need perspective. The second thing is you need persistence or perseverance. And the third and the last thing is you need is patience. James said, the testing of your faith produces patience. And when patience has its perfect work. You know there's no such thing as overnight success in life. And you know what? We live in a culture where people want instant gratification. They want everything now. Want it now. Want it now. And that's the biggest mistake they can make. See, Joshua and Caleb, how long was it from the time they first brought back that bunch of grapes till they actually went and lived among the grapes? How long? 40 years. Moses was 80 years old when he began his ministry, and he did it till he was 120. We look at Abraham, he was 100 years old when he waited 25 years for the promise of having a child. You look through history and you see all kinds of stories like this. Winston Churchill was still winning elections at 80 years old. Benjamin Franklin, he drafted the Constitution of the U.S. at 81 years old. Mother Teresa was in the slums of Calcutta, still ministering at 84 years of age. John Wesley was still preaching on horseback 2 times a day, 7 days a week at 86 years old. George Bernard Shaw, he wrote his last play when he was 94 years old. And see, we just don't understand this thing called patience. But the scripture tells us this, that we will persevere. If we will stay in the midst of it, if we will face down the adversity that comes our way, this light affliction, which is but for a moment, this light affliction called life is working out a far greater eternal weight of glory. And there is nothing that you can't overcome in this world, because greater is he who is in you than who that is in the world. And if God be for you, who can be against?
Church of the Rock has services every Sunday at 1397 Buffalo Place, and we invite you to join us when you're in the Winnipeg area. If you'd like a booklet to help you understand more about God's gift of forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus Christ, please contact us, and we'd be happy to send you a free copy of the Book of Hope. Visit our website at www.churchoftherock.ca. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.